Hello, hi, and welcome to our podcast, Reality Atlas. This is Jeff Fitzpatrick in Dublin with.
Scott Onstadt in Canada. How are you doing
So,
today?
I'm doing good, Scott. I hope our listeners are too. And today we've decided to talk about the question, are we living in a simulation? Isn't that right, Scott?
Yes, it is an interesting question. When you get into why would we ask that question? What what
Yeah.
what motivates you to ask that question, Jeff?
Well, I think in my own journey with this, like I remember when I first saw the Matrix movie I think I saw it in 1999, and it was a kind of a life-changing event for me, and I've subsequently become like an absolute crazy fanboy of the entire Matrix universe. I've read the comics. I'm one of those people that loves not just Matrix 1, but Matrix 2, 3, and 4. I'm very, very happy there's Matrix 5. So, like, I've completely lost my mind over the Matrix philosophy.
Can I
It's
tell
something
you?
that
I
I,
want to tell you a little tidbit about that.
yeah.
When I was teaching in San Francisco, one of my students, one of my best students ever, um, was offered the job of technical director of the Matrix film. Like he was going to do the special effects of it.
Whoa.
and
I didn't know
um
that.
and he turned it down, I think, because he had to finish his schooling. And then he went on LinkedIn. I looked him up, and now he's like one of the head honchos at Nvidia.
Oh, my
And it's like
goodness.
incredible that like your students grow up and they become,
Oh,
in some cases they're like doing amazing things that far exceed the teacher,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
so that's a successful story of a student who um, took what I was teaching about 3D computer graphics. I was teaching 3ds Max, and he went and ran with it, which is cool.
Fascinating, Scott. Yeah, and like he obviously had a bright mind, and he must have been very early if he was tapped into the Matrix evolution.
And
But look,
I think he was from South America, and he won the lottery to be get a green card to work in the US.
cool.
Yeah,
Wow.
which is
Uh,
rare. I
That's what got
think
him started.
it's like impossible to get to do that, basically, and he did that. Anyway,
So,
The
so
Matrix was
why
such an
simulation?
influential film, and it broke through like the special effects. Everybody remembers those, like
Bullet
the bullet,
time, it was
bullets,
called, the
yeah,
surround
all that
sound.
stuff, and
Yeah,
the bending of
yeah,
reality. You know,
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Um, oh, it broke all new special effects. To be honest, the special effects and the fighting and the kind of the superhero side of the Matrix is very secondary for me. It really what's primary is like it's the writing, it's the philosophy, it's
yeah.
the story, and it goes very, very deep. I remember there was a commentary done with Ken Wilber and another wonderful philosopher. I should know his name. Um, but they did a beautiful commentary on it. But let's be honest, what makes The Matrix stand apart is its philosophical depth. And really, if you don't know about The Matrix, this is probably going to be a really boring episode for you. But if you do know about The Matrix, it's essentially, it's one of the best articulations of the idea that everything we know to be real is in fact a simulation, and that we are trapped inside a kind of a program of sorts that we believe to be real, but we are blinded from the fact that there are powers behind the curtain that we can't see, that are, in the Matrix case, enslaving us so that they can live off our energy, so that those powers of control can feed themselves. And so therein was kind of my first. I mean, I just love it as a sort of a sci-fi, fantastic philosophical journey. But in recent years, Scott, you and I have spoken about this. The idea of living in a simulation and simulation theory has become more and more popular, and people have been taking it more and more literally. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, I think it's gained in popularity. I think there was a philosophical paper by Nick Bostrom in the early 2000s that talked about this possibility. And I know Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson have sort of signed up to that theory. And I think that um, it's a reasonable and logical thing to do when you start to recognize all of the coincidences, seeming coincidences or synchronicities, that indicate that there's something going on, that isn't random. And
Yeah.
for example, for me, one of the primary signals of that is the fact that the our moon perfectly covers the sun during a total solar eclipse. And
Mm.
it's like perfect. And we know that the moon is moving away from the earth slowly. And so this won't always be the case. But during this time that human beings are on the earth, we have this perfection. And people are generally aware of that, but they don't seem to care, or they don't seem to, it doesn't seem to wake them out of their matrix.
Yeah.
They're happy eating the steak in the matrix.
Yeah.
They don't think, wait, that's like a huge sign that this is not arbitrary. There's something perfect about this.
Yeah.
And we know from studying sacred geometry, like, and John Michel discovered in 1972 that the moon and the earth fit in this beautiful simple diagram that anyone can draw in about 20 minutes, that is involved with the pentagram, with squaring the circle, the moon and earth and the great pyramid slope angle all come out of this simple diagram that is just too amazing to be
Yeah.
random chance. And it's super accurate. I think it's like 99.9 or 99.8% accurate. And so this is another thing, another subject, Jeff, that we know a lot, where something is so highly correlated. It's 99.9%, but because it's not exact, that's enough for literalists to completely dismiss the whole subject.
Mm.
And that
Mm.
is just staggering to me, that wow, it's because it's not absolutely perfect. You're willing to toss out the entire notion of it. It's almost like I had a car that's 99.9% red, and you say,
Mm.
well, that's not really red.
Yeah. It has to be
But
100%.
yeah,
Yeah, I think the literalists, they certainly lack an ability to open their minds to not knowing things for certain. That lets a lot of people in our modern world feel uncomfortable, you know. People have a longing for certainty and things to be definite
but
and to be
we
concrete and to be 100%.
but
And then you'd
we
show them
can't
something
when we
like pi.
yeah, we can't ever really know anything for certain. That
Mm.
that's kind of the truth of it, though. What do
Yeah,
we know absolutely 100% for certain? Maybe is the only thing you could say, that would be your own experience.
yeah, yeah.
You
I agree.
experienced it, and you can even
Let's
doubt that. You can even
let's
try to
loop
doubt
back.
that. Yeah.
Let's loop back to simulation, Scott, and for the sake of our readers, or sorry, our listeners here, let's frame this little chat we're having, right? So it gives people a roadmap of what we're talking about. So there is this simulation theory. It's very, very interesting, which we're going to discuss. But we want to sort of move through to share with you how Scott and I don't actually subscribe to simulation theory. Our point of view is that it doesn't hold up ultimately, and we have a different hypothesis, which we're going to end this little chat with at the end.
Well,
And so we just want to
I can
bring you
tell you
through that.
why. Like, why is it that we don't? At least I can speak for myself. Why
Well,
I don't buy into the
before we
simulation?
jump to the
Yeah.
end, can I ask you a few questions about why it's fair and reasonable that some people could consider the reality we experience to be a simulation? You mentioned
Yeah.
there the coincidences, you mentioned about like the sun and the moon, but like there's things like deja vu, there's things like coincidences that happen, there's incredible patterns of order that happen at every scale, and there's this kind of series of coincidences that continually kind of like are available for us to see. Would you share some of those, Scott?
Yeah. I think that when you get into the study of sacred geometry, you encounter more of these patterns of order that are ultimately geometric in nature. That are indicating that there's a deeper order, at least a pattern. For example, I'm thinking of John Martineau's Book of Coincidence, um,
Beautiful.
where he shows that the relationships between the planetary orbits are governed by um, simple two-dimensional geometries. And he's able to make this breakthrough by looking at the mean orbit. And in some cases, he looks at the closest and the farthest orbits, and he correlates these in a beautiful way where you end up with these sacred geometry diagrams that correlate between the motions of the planets. And in our previous episode, we talked about Mercury and how it has a beautiful sacred geometry pattern relative to the Earth. But it's also true of all of the planets with each other and with the Earth. And you start to say, oh my goodness, there's this deep ordering principle at work here. But what ends up happening in science is when a scientist encounters such a thing, it doesn't fit the framework of science. And so it would be called a coincidence typically, and dismissed as such, because it doesn't fit into the narrative about randomness, and there can't be some kind of deeper ordering there, you see, when you buy into the idea of um, materialism. There isn't any room in that theory for a deeper ordering principle. And yet, if you look closely, you can find that. But then you're out immediately out on the skinny branches of culture, because you're in a small group of people that is able to perceive these synchronicities, these coincidences, and not immediately reflexively dismiss them. And
Mm.
it reminds me also of the crop circle phenomenon and the UAP or UFO phenomenon, in that these are well documented things that happen, and millions of people in the world have seen them. But generally, we tend to ignore all of that because it doesn't fit into the narrative.
Mm.
And and but those things are scary in a way for the dominant paradigm, because they suggest non-human intelligences,
Mm.
and we don't have literal proof of that, so we have to ignore it,
Mm.
even though like millions of people have seen UFOs, for example, that they must be hallucinating, you
Mm.
know. And what I think the most fascinating aspect of all of that, Jeff, is the psychological phenomenon of the ability to sweep things under the rug and put them in the shadow and keep them in the shadow, and just don't look there because we're not ready to deal with that, or it it would upend the apple cart in some way
Mm.
to do that, because it would require that we rethink our worldview.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I
we're
like what you're saying. Yeah, it's like I was thinking about this simulation theory thing, right? And even though ultimately I get to a place where I don't believe it's a simulation, I believe everything is consciousness ultimately. I want to step into the shoes of somebody who might be, in a reasonable way, seeing the signals of reality as a fair way to make a hypothesis that potentially it's a simulation. So you're talking there about patterns of order, right? And they occur at every scale. And you mentioned the patterns in the solar system. You've got like Venus drawing this gorgeous pentagonal geometry around planet Earth. And that's the same geometry that gives form to our bodies, or the plants that grow like roses and daisies. And it goes all the way down to our DNA. So you have the same patterning order. It's the golden ratio, same patterning order at all these different levels. And so, in a weird kind of a way, or in an understandable kind of a way, you can kind of say, God, it almost looks like it's like a language, or it's like sort of a programming structure or ordering mechanism of reality. This is very like a computer program, you know? So, like, I can totally go with people there. I can say, yeah, it does kind of look like that in a way, you know?
Yeah,
And so,
I think it's a really positive step away from the dominant paradigm, is to make this first step and start thinking about a simulation as an
mm,
explanation for
mm,
what we're seeing here, because it can't really be explained by the normal standard model, and so it has, maybe everything is in a computer program. I mean,
mhm.
I'm sympathetic to that view, but
And let's bring
yeah.
it. Sorry, sorry to talk over you, Scott, but I just wanted to bring in the Matrix here, right? Because this correlates with what you wrote in the book. And I remember in the second Matrix, Matrix Reloaded, when Neo is he's escaped from the Matrix and he's in the so-called real world, okay? And when he's in the real world, he's just a human like you and I, and he's not meant to have any of these superpowers because he's just like a true human in the real world, okay? However, at the end of the movie, for some reason, he's able to hold up his hand and he can stop the Sentinels. And it's a really kind of like it's a needle across the record moment in the Matrix journey where everybody goes, wait, what? No way. How can he do that? That can't happen in the real world. And then that makes you go, oh, but what if the real world is only another simulation? And now so, and you make reference to that in your book about this recursive simulations, but it eventually falls over on itself. Could I ask you about that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I had forgotten about that aspect of the second Matrix movie, but that is a signal that there's nothing in the simulation hypothesis that would prohibit that simulation, that real world that is simulating our world itself, be a simulation in another, even more real world, and so on, recursively and
Forever.
forever. And so that argument collapses in what they call a reductio ad absurdum fallacy, because there's nothing about each successive world that's more real.
Mm,
It, and you can never, it's like a series of Russian dolls that goes on forever. And it doesn't bring you any closer to truth or understanding. It's just passing the buck.
mm.
And
Yeah.
that doesn't, Occam's razor comes in and says the simplest explanation is probably the correct one, not one where we have an infinite number of universes going on forever to explain the unexplainable. That doesn't
Hmm.
really offer an explanation. It just moves the buck to some other distant universe where that's running all the simulations.
Mm,
And so for me, that's where that argument collapses, because of that potential for infinite recursion within.
hmm.
And it's fascinating. That's kind of a, you see that in geometry where you have, you can make a geometry of, I'm thinking like circles that are all tangent to one another and they can just keep on going in and in. It's called the
Yeah, I love that.
Apollonian gasket, where you just have an infinite number of circles that are all tangent to each other and there's nowhere it stops. And so
Yeah.
that doesn't really explain anything. It just forms a pattern. It doesn't explain the pattern. It's just yet another pattern. And so what are patterns? They're relationships between geometries, they're relationships between math, they're a manipulation of symbols. But ultimately, all of those things are just a language that's parsed by consciousness.
Mm.
And so consciousness to me is a much better explanation for the universe. The
May
universe,
I
yeah,
jump in here, Scott?
yes,
Just because I'm loving where you're going, but I just wanted to sort of bring people with us. Okay, so we're kind of saying, when people begin noticing these patterns of order, this kind of deeper intelligence, these signatures of like a computer program running reality, it's not unreasonable to consider it as a simulation hypothesis. And you're saying that it's actually a step forward away from the kind of the reductive, narrow worldview that the modern paradigm sort of conditions us into. So simulation theory is kind of a step in the right direction,
yeah.
but we're suggesting, we're inviting you to move beyond that. And so, Scott, the question is, if it's not a simulation, what is it?
It's a work of imagination, ultimately. in consciousness.
I
And
mean, you say sometimes all is consciousness.
mhm,
Everything is consciousness. Is that, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
yeah.
I'm keen to get you into explaining that idea about the ultimate or all is consciousness. Like, what does that mean?
Well, it's sort of like everything that we typically understand about reality is all upside down and backwards. We think that we live in the dominant paradigm, we think that we live in this physical universe and we're separate creatures with separate minds, and we never really understand each other. How can I understand your mind? I can't see your mind from inside. I only simulate your mind in mine. And we have this very atomistic Western view of reality, and we cut it apart, we analyze it down to its building blocks. And when we get to those building blocks, we find out they're not really things, but they're actually relationships, and ultimately they're just math. And math is just an idea. And it's very difficult to go from this notion of concrete physical reality to the next step, which is to realize that you have it all inside out and backwards, and that consciousness, the world mind, is imagining all of those relationships. And you are also an imaginary character in consciousness that has a life of its own, that has its own identity and your own, you can say, I am this person, but that in itself is a kind of illusion. Um, but we want to embody that illusion and be that person and have this,
Yeah, yeah.
you
And
know,
like,
yeah, and play this video game
yeah,
essentially. And it's interesting that we make these video games, we make these illusory worlds, um, because that's what we've done as consciousness. And
yeah,
we're making
yeah,
this little play within a play in the on our human scale that points to the reality of what life is about. It's about
yeah.
recapitulating the creation of the universe by making a drama, by making a story. I think of the Truman Show movie, where the character has grown up inside this artificial reality his whole life, and then a star falls from the sky, and it's like a theatrical light,
Yeah.
and he sees a hole in the sky, and he eventually sees through the reality. He's peeling back the curtain. He's seeing beyond, and he's starting to say, "Wait, I live in a simulation."
Mm.
And that's a great first step. Oh, yes, I live in the simulation. And then you go out into the real world, right? And break out of the sound studio and you go out onto the streets of Hollywood. And you're like,
Hmm.
oh my God, I'm in the real world. I've broken through. And yet, another 10 years later, they should make the Truman Show part two, where he realizes that Hollywood and all of reality is also a kind of stage set,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and seeing through that as well, you know,
Mm.
because they're all like games within games, or um, dramas within dramas, or
Yeah.
dreams within dreams, is what all of this is made of ultimately. And we know that by probing deeply into the building blocks of reality, and we find
Hmm.
that there's actually nothing there. Remember,
Yeah.
the atom is made of empty space. If if the hydrogen atom was blown up to the size of the sun, the electron would be out where Neptune is.
Hmm.
And there's nothing in between them.
Mm.
Just like there's nothing in between the sun and Neptune but space, almost all just nothingness.
Yeah, it's a good metaphor, space. I like the idea of like space consciousness, you know. But let's talk about waking up or escaping the matrix, right? So it's so beautifully expressed in the Matrix, where you see that very kind of archetypal scene where Neo is discovered inside a pod in these fields of incarcerated humans who are all plugged into the Matrix. and they're essentially asleep in the real world in their incarcerated state in these pods. And then Neo wakes up and it's very traumatic and he gets unplugged and he gets it's really quite birth like that whole sequence. It's an amazing scene. And he wakes up in the so-called real world, right? And so if we're saying that like reality is not a simulation, we're not going to wake up like Neo. I'd like to put forward a hypothesis, a suggestion about how do we wake up then out of this slumber, out of thinking that like everything we experience through our senses and through our perceptions is reality. And so it's something to do with this type of touching that spaciousness that you're talking about. You know, it's like only through experiencing the awareness do you get to escape the confines of the narrow little me, you know, the narrow version of who I am in the world with all the masks I wear and the roles I play, you know? How do I escape from that? You know, because I think we all have a longing to one escape from that and experience the liberation of union with the source from which we come. And then at the same time, we seem to have a desire to move back into the illusion and into the dance, just like you're talking about, like Cypher wanting to be replugged in to eat the steak. And there's almost like this interplay between the longing for freedom and the longing to sort of play the game, you know? And if you can kind of become very proficient at like awakening and freeing yourself from the clutches of the matrix, you know, and then come back into the world, you can kind of wear those masks more loosely or something. So my question is, how do we awaken, Scott? My thinking is that it's through a deep, visceral experience of awareness itself has the most power to enable you free yourself from the clutches of all the thinking, all the ideas, all of those things just dissolve and float away, and you actually become awareness itself. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's more than a perceptual shift. It is only apprehendable by your own experience, because you
Mm,
have to let go of the ego. You have to even let go of the mind and just continue experiencing and continue and experience that spaciousness, that kind of eternal, unchanging background of consciousness. And then you kind of dissolve. And then once you have experienced that, it's time to turn around and go back in and go and re-inhabit that avatar that you're playing in this game, and go back into your body and embrace the drama and
mhm.
embrace your limitation, because it's only through that like Saturnian limitation that progress is made. And yeah, so I think it's natural to go back and forth between the
And
mundane
the more
the mundane experience of being in your body in the world and the sacred experience of ultimate liberation and freedom, of
mm,
just experiencing awareness.
and the
And
more you do that, you flicker between, you know, expansive union with just being awareness and then having to come into the world and do the dishes, you know, or choose what carpet you want, you know. You're dancing between these two modes of being. I feel what happens is the more expanded you become, the more you bring back something from that spaciousness into choosing the carpet, and the whole experience of choosing the carpet becomes imbued with something much more um, significant, you know, much more important, I think. And we imbue this reality then with something much bigger than our little selves.
yeah, and you can also get past disappointment and not not liking some aspect of reality when you go back and forth like that. Like you can
Mm.
do it very quickly actually. um
Mm.
but you can value even those setbacks and so on, I think, because you're privileged in a way to be even having those setbacks and those, because it's all part of this exquisitely crafted drama that you're part of.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's absolutely staggering in its complexity and its beauty and its thoughtfulness. And you start to see these so-called coincidences and synchronicities are actually intentional patterns that have been set up by greater intelligences.
Mhm.
Um, and you don't, I don't know, I think it's very refreshing to shift your worldview in this way. Otherwise, you're very, very limited. And I think that's super boring. And you've got to get out of that and find that missing tile in the sky where where the light has fallen out in the Truman Show, and you can see just see beyond the reality a little bit and start to question it. And I think that, like we were saying, the idea of a simulation is a great first step in doubting reality in some way and saying, wait a minute, that's just too perfect to be like totally random, isn't it? Like, what are the
Mhm.
chances? What are and what are the chances that all of these physics constants are tuned perfectly to give us this universe that we get to inhabit and enjoy?
Mhm.
Um, they're astronomical against it. So that's telling you that there's some kind of plan or guidance or um, pattern of order, if you like. Um, I wanted to read a little bit from John Michel's introduction to the Book of Coincidence by John Martineau. Um, Let me just find, he's talking in here about um, coincidence. John Michel says, coincidence is indeed a much undervalued phenomenon. In a mechanistic cosmos, it is actually without scientific value. And so the findings contained within these pages of the Book of Coincidence, which may all be rightly termed coincidences, exist outside the experience of a science which has abandoned its metaphysics. It is curious that the word coincidence means happening together, and yet today one generally hears a coincidence referred to as only a coincidence, suggesting that things happening together are now merely side issues compared to things which are isolated. Okay, end quote. Now, I think that's interesting because it gets to the very Western idea of analysis,
Mhm.
separation, of atomizing everything, of taking it all apart. And that's a very important impulse to understand nature and understand reality. But it's only half of the story, isn't it?
Mhm.
What's the other half, Jeff?
Well, things happening together, this confluence of events, I mean, for me, what happens is there can be something happening in my interior experience, and it's very particular and very exact. I mean, I'll give an example about one time I was thinking about a dodecahedron very explicitly, right? It's a very particular shape. And I walked by a window in London, and right in front of my face in that moment was a perfect dodecahedron, right? Now, modern culture would say, oh, that's funny, like go back to sleep, America, nothing to see here, right? It's just a coincidence. But what's fascinating is this comes with an incredibly meaningful emotional charge for me. And it makes me go, whoa, like, hang on a minute now. Wait, 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 wait. What is happening here? How come these two things are happening together right now? How did these converge so perfectly for this? It feels like there's this reflexive relationship between what's going on inside my consciousness and what's manifesting in material reality. And this is where I could really understand people feeling like they're in a computer program, because it's very like that, you know. I've had coincidence as well where I think of a red car and I see a red car and it's no big deal. It's like, oh, whatever, that probably is just a nothing coincidence, you know. But if you have one that has an emotional charge, if you have one that's particularly unusual or unique and feels very personal to you, and sometimes they feel like there's a communication of some sort going on. Whoa, like I think they are one of the most significant glitches in the matrix that I've experienced personally. Very different to the black cat, you know, or sorry, very similar to the black cat, but much more potent. You know, did that answer your question, Scott? I was trying to attend to
Yeah,
things
absolutely.
happening together, you know?
Yeah. Actually, the quote I read you previously was John Martineau himself. And
Ah,
there's another quote I want to read you that John Michel wrote
yeah.
in reference to that. So here it is. The traditional image of a geometer creator, who, in the words of the Apocrypha, made all things in measure, number, and weight, does not go with the modern scientific way of seeing things. This does not mean that it is extinct. John Martineau's discoveries will no doubt be taken by religious creationists and fundamentalists as evidence for literal beliefs. They or anyone else can make what they like of this data, for the discoverer gives no indication of how he himself interprets it, and he does not even discuss implications. That is for the very good, honest reason that he really does not know what to think. By admitting that, rather than clinging on to some opinion, he has opened himself to revelations. By calling this a book of coincidence, it avoids the question of meaning. Any one of the planetary proportions illustrated in these diagrams could have occurred by random chance. But as the examples accumulate and the same series of common geometric ratios are discovered within the planetary system, the influence of some organizing principle becomes apparent. Organizing principle, he says.
Mm.
To call it
Yeah.
an organizing principle is about as far as one can safely go. It is impossible to be more specific without adopting some controversial form of belief or myth. One can think of God, the creator of a geometrical law in nature, on chance and necessity, but no particular first cause is clearly identifiable. So he goes on, but I think the organizing principle is a good name for this thing that we encounter, a few of us encounter, and then the first step is to say, well, maybe we live in a simulation. But then when you start to think that through and you realize the reductio ad absurdum possibility of having recursive simulations, you need to search for another explanation for what's going on. And how could that be? And I think consciousness provides a framework that doesn't have that possibility of a fallacy of recursive subdivisions because it's your own experience that you're experiencing right now. And that can't be subdivided or thrown into a million different universes. It's what you're always experiencing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is like, you know, this experience of being, you know, a participant in conventional reality. What I mean by that is what we experience through our five senses in our everyday state of consciousness, you know, is only kind of resting upon a much, much deeper layer of reality that we are. It's not. I sometimes talk about it like we have to go and visit there. We have to awaken. We have to like escape the matrix. We have to experience ourselves as awareness. You know, but anytime I have had breakthroughs into being one with awareness and simply abiding in awareness itself, it's not like somewhere I've gone. I haven't done anything. It's almost like I've stopped forgetting that I'm separate from it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's like we're all of us, everybody, everything is just awareness at a deeper level, you know? And so and then I talk about you come back into the matrix, then you want to eat the steak and you want to pick your carpet or whatever, then that feels like it's a separate activity, it's a separate reality. But it's not, you know, it's like it's just a different layer of experience that you're having, you know? And so I think like but just speaking for myself, my own journey has been this kind of like step by step gradual um bringing together of this disparity between my everyday reality and then the kind of infinite realm of awareness, you know, as these two separate poles on a spectrum. And like ever so gently, you know, I'm nearly 50 now, and I'm kind of bringing together the fact that these aren't different things. It's just all one thing, you know. And in different moments, in different states, I experience it differently, but that doesn't mean it's different.
You're still experiencing it either way,
Yeah,
aren't
yeah,
you? Yeah. No
yeah,
matter
exactly.
what thoughts you're having or whether it's sacred or mundane,
And
you're still experiencing it.
can I talk about one thing? And it's a bit of a sidebar. So I hope we've made the point that like we like simulation theory to a point, but we think you need to take it further. And then ultimately we end up in a place, you know, I mean, this is Scott and Jeff's opinion, where, you know, take it or leave it, but that we sort of lean towards all is consciousness, all is awareness ultimately. So that's kind of the where we've gone to. But I did want to sort of maybe we could end on a little bit of a sidebar, Scott, in terms of you know this idea that like we are the kind of we are the product of our influences, all of us, you know, and what we choose to rest our heart and minds upon, we become essentially, right? Or at least that's what we experience. And patterns are very formative in our lives. And so I know for a fact if I wake up in the morning, I take out my phone, I look at really bad news, for example, then I drive into work, I put on the radio, I get another media stream into my consciousness. Then I get into the people in the office and they've all had the same journey into work and they're all speaking about the same stuff. There's a kind of a narrowing going on of my experience. You know, there's this sort of blinkering that occurs. And then when you run that pattern enough, day after day, 365 days a year, you slowly forget that there are vistas of reality outside those blinkers, you know? And so I do caution everybody, myself included, into always remembering that, like, we are all, you know, vulnerable to a narrowing of our experience through the blinkers we choose to put upon ourselves, you know, and especially in the technology that drives the world. It's I'm making specific reference to the algorithms that sort of command our consciousness so wholeheartedly, only to scatter it, you know, over and over again. This repetitive pattern of like your consciousness being absorbed by an algorithm only to be scattered, that is a very kind of like reducing experience. And if you run that pattern every day, you're going to be reduced. Now, conversely, if you wake up, you do some meditation, you go for a walk in the park, you honor the sun, you feel connected to nature, you feel, you know, the miracle of being alive, the fact that you've got 70 trillion cells vibrating in this miraculous way to allow you to have this experience, and you run that program over and over again, that's a very different experience of reality that you're going to have, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And the question is, how do we choose that? Um, how does a person elect to have a different experience? And do you feel empowered to make that choice? Do you know?
Mm.
Like, for example, I stopped using social media, which in itself is a revolutionary act, it seems, these days.
Mm. Yeah.
But I'm much better for it.
Mm.
Um, I don't, a person doesn't need that, really. I lived many years of my life without that prior to the invention of social media. And I didn't feel like it was contributing positively to my life. So there's an example of a person who's walked away from such a thing.
Yeah. And it's like I'm picking on social media and news streams and, the modern technologies of our world because I think they affect most of us today. But I suppose the bigger point I'm making is, allow yourself become aware of the mind loops you run for yourself because they do become a program of sorts that you're running in consciousness. I'm not saying we are computer programs living in a simulation. I'm not saying that, but the metaphor is helpful. The metaphor is helpful,
And we are programmable, and marketers know that very
You bet.
well.
You
And
bet.
so I think it's within your power to kind of opt out of
Mm,
programs that aren't serving you, that aren't bringing you joy.
mm.
And you have that power as the chooser, as a person who is living this life. You have that ability to decide what enters your field, don't you? But
And
most people
yeah, and
don't exercise that. They don't feel
yeah.
empowered in some way to make that choice. We're swept along in the stream, and then
I'd like to
you're programmed in a way.
yeah, we're programmed. So how do we break the program? Maybe we could end on this, Scott. Maybe we could give our listeners a little gift. But I was thinking about you know, how do you break free from these contractions that bind us all on a daily basis? And like, I love to meditate. I love to make sand mandalas. I love to do breath work. There's a whole range of techniques. But then ultimately, what I'm trying to get to is a place where I don't need any technique. I don't need to climb up the mountain to be free anymore. I want to just be free here and now, driving into work in every moment. And one of the greatest exercises that I've come across that you can do every day in any moment is simply just take a pause and ask yourself the question, am I aware? Okay. Now, the very cool thing you do with this question is before you answer it, just allow yourself fall into the gap between the question and the answer. And it's a really fun, playful thing to do. It comes from the great teacher, Rupert Spira, who I really adore. You might want to check him out. But it's just something that I've done it cycling on a bike. I've done it like driving in rush hour. I've done it like in the supermarket. And so I'll leave that with you to experiment with. But ask yourself it a couple of times a day, am I aware? And then before you go, oh yeah, well, I can feel my body and I can see things and I can hear things. And before you get into all the answering, allow yourself just fall into the spaciousness between the question and the answer.
Love it.
Is
That's
that a
where the
nice
magic
place to,
is. Yeah.
will we, let's wrap there. I hope you enjoyed it, guys. That was a fun conversation about not living in the simulation. We'll be back soon. Thank you.